The most devastating move in the game of power isn't confrontation, it's absence. Think about this. When someone disrespects you, betrays your trust, or takes you for granted, what's your immediate reaction? You want to fight back, explain yourself, make them understand what they've lost. You want them to see you standing up for yourself. That instinct, it's the reason you remain powerless in their eyes. Because every word you speak in your defense is another thread they can pull. Every explanation is another negotiation. And Machiavelli understood something that modern psychology has only recently confirmed. The human mind is not designed to process absence, it's designed to chase it. In the next 20 minutes, I'll reveal the 7 psychological devastations that occur when you strategically disappear from someone's reality, and why this ancient Machiavellian tactic destroys power dynamics more efficiently than any argument ever could. In Chapter 8 of The Prince, Machiavelli doesn't just discuss power, he dissects the mechanics of psychological dominance. He observed that the most feared rulers weren't those who punished constantly, but those whose presence and absence created unbearable uncertainty. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was strategic manipulation of human attention architecture. Modern society has conditioned you to believe that engagement equals strength, that responding, defending, and setting boundaries through communication demonstrates power. This is a lie sold to keep you negotiating your value in relationships, careers, and social hierarchies. The truth that Machiavellian philosophy reveals in that dark psychology confirms is that availability destroys value. When you're always present, always responsive, always explainable, you become part of the expected environment. You become furniture in someone's life, and furniture has no power. But when you disappear without explanation, without warning, without the closure that human psychology desperately craves, you transform from furniture into ghost. And ghosts haunt minds far more effectively than physical presence ever could. The masses who consume self-help content will never understand this. They're taught to communicate clearly and express their feelings. They're turned into emotional slot machines, predictable, manageable, controllable. You're still here because part of you recognizes that visibility without value is just exposure. And exposure without strategic absence is weakness. But here's what most people miss about disappearance as a power tactic. It's not about revenge. It's not about making them miss you. Those are surface-level games played by amateurs. Strategic disappearance is about reclaiming frame control through the one move. They cannot counter your refusal to exist in their reality. Now let's break down exactly what happens in their psychology when you vanish. Because each stage is a systematic dismantling of the power they thought they held over you. First, psychological devastation. Their predictive model of you shatters. Every relationship, romantic, professional, familial, operates on a predictive algorithm. Their brain has created a model of who you are based on your patterns. You respond within X time frame. You react to disrespect with Y behavior. You need them for Z reasons. This model gives them certainty. Uncertainty gives them control. When you disappear without explanation, you don't just break a pattern, you invalidate their entire predictive framework. Their brain experiences this as a cognitive emergency. The model that told them this person is manageable, knowable, controllable, suddenly produces error messages. Machiavelli observed this in political alliances. When a minor prince suddenly withdrew from an expected coalition without explanation, major powers didn't feel relieved. They felt destabilized because they'd built strategies on predicted behavior. Let me show you how this works in modern power dynamics. A corporate executive spent 3 years as the dependable department head, always responsive to his CEO's requests, always available for crisis management, always explaining his decisions when questioned. He was valued but not respected. It was the known quantity. When a private equity acquisition began, he simply stopped engaging, didn't respond to speculative questions about his plans, didn't defend his department's value in political meetings. Then it explained his weekend interview trips with competitors. Within 2 weeks, the CEO who'd taken him for granted offered him coup position, a role that hadn't existed before. Not because the executive became more competent, but because he became unpredictable. The certainty collapse forced a value recalibration is the mechanism. Human brains assign value based on scarcity and unpredictability. When you're constantly available, constantly explainable, your value calculates as low scarcity, high predictability. This combination creates the perception of replaceability, but when you disappear, the calculation inverts to high scarcity, low predictability, and this combination triggers obsessive valuation recalculation. They don't miss you emotionally at first. They miss the certainty you provided. And in attempting to restore that certainty, they're forced to confront that they built the reality on assumptions about your permanence. Most people never weaponize this because they're addicted to being understood. They think explanation equals respect. But Machiavelli knew that mystery equals magnitude. When they can't explain your absence, they're forced to magnify your significance, to make sense of the void. Now, most people stop here. They disappear, watch the person panic, then return feeling validated. That's why they fail. Because the real devastation isn't in the initial absence. It's in what happens when their attempts to restore certainty meet absolute silence. Second, psychological devastation. You deny them the ability to frame the story. In any power dynamic, the person who controls the narrative controls the relationship's reality. When conflicts arise, the battle isn't about truth, it's about whose version becomes the agreed-upon story. If you're present, if you're responding, if you're defending yourself, you're participating in their narrative structure. Even if you win the argument, you've already lost frame control because you've accepted their framing that this situation requires your participation. Strategic disappearance is narrative assassination. Machiavelli wrote in chapter 18 of The Prince about the power of being formidable in absence. He observed that enemies who could be engaged could be defined, but enemies who refused engagement became legendary not because of their actions, but because of the stories that filled the void of information. Here's what happens psychologically. When you disappear without explanation, they're left holding an incomplete story. And human minds are narrative completion machines. We cannot tolerate stories without endings. So they write the ending themselves. But here's the dark part. The endings they write reveal their own insecurities, not your reality. If they tell themselves they disappeared because they were weak and couldn't handle confrontation, that reveals their need to feel powerful. If they tell themselves they were secretly planning this all along, that reveals their paranoia about being out. If they tell themselves they never cared about me, that reveals their fear of insignificance. Every narrative they construct to explain your absence becomes a mirror of their psychological vulnerabilities. In 1513, when Machiavelli himself was exiled from Florence, he didn't write desperate letters explaining his innocence. He disappeared into his estate and wrote the Prince a text that would outlive everyone who exiled him. His absence from their political games didn't diminish his power, it immortalized it. Consider the modern parallel. A woman ended a relationship with a manipulative partner who'd spent years controlling conversations through gaslighting and reframing. Every previous attempt to leave involved hours of exhausting conversation, where he'd twist her words and make her doubt her perceptions. The final time, she simply left. No explanation, text. No closure conversation. No response to his 100 messages asking, "What did I do?" Within a week, he'd constructed 17 different narratives and texts to mutual friends. Each one contradicted the last. Each one revealed a different insecurity. By refusing to provide the real story, she forced him to expose that he'd never actually understood her. Atalone controlled the narrative about her. His social circle watched him unravel, trying to write an ending to a story where he no longer had a co-author. This is the suffocation. When you disappear, they can't argue with you. You can't reframe your position, can't make you the villain in a story where you're not even a character anymore. They're left shadowboxing with their own projections. If you're still watching this, you already understand what most people refuse to see. Engagement is not power. Engagement is the negotiation of power, and you cannot lose a negotiation you refuse to enter. But there's something even more psychologically devastating than narrative collapse, something that happens around day 7 to 14 of total silence. It's where their relationship to reality itself begins to crack. Third, psychological devastation. You reveal that they were addicted to you as a source of narcissistic supply. Most people don't understand the neurochemical dimension of power dynamics. Every interaction with another person triggers dopamine oxytocin reward cycles. When someone knows they can get a reaction from you, anger, explanation, hurt, even measured calmness, they're getting a biochemical payoff. They're addicted to you as a responsive object. Machiavelli understood this intuitively. In chapter 17, he discusses whether it's better to be loved or feared. but the deeper implication is about attention control. Those who love you and those who fear you share one thing: they're psychologically oriented toward you. Their emotional state depends on your presence or approval. This gives you power, but only if you understand how to weaponize withdrawal. When you disappear completely, you're not just removing your presence, you're cutting off their supply. And like any addiction withdrawal, the psychological response follows predictable stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, obsessive attempt to restore supply. Here's where weak people and powerful people diverge completely. Weak people disappear as punishment. They want the other person to suffer, to feel bad, to realize what they've lost. This is emotional thinking. This means they're still oriented toward the other person's experience, which means they haven't actually reclaimed power. Powerful people disappear as redirection. They're not focused on what the other person feels. They're focused on reallocating their attention to higher value targets. The disappearance isn't about the person they're leaving, it's about the life they're building that no longer has space for low value interactions. This distinction is everything. In 2019, a tech founder discovered his co-founder was sabotaging investor meetings to maintain control. The typical response would be confrontation, documentation, legal threats. Instead, he simply stopped attending shared meetings, stopped responding to urgent messages, stopped participating in the company narrative. Within 3 weeks, the saboteur co-founder experienced complete psychological collapse. Not because he missed his partner, but because he'd built his entire identity on being the one in control of someone who reacted. Without that reactive supply, his sense of self disintegrated. The company eventually split, but the power dynamic had permanently inverted. The founder who disappeared got the better terms, the investor relationships, and the narrative, because he'd demonstrated that he didn't need any of it. That's frame control through absence. Here's the mechanism. Humans are social primates with hierarchical nervous systems. We're wired to constantly assess our position in social hierarchies. When someone responds to us, argues with us, explains to us, our brain registers, this person considers me significant enough to allocate attention to. Even negative attention confirms significance. But when you completely disappear, no anger, no explanation, no breadcrumbs, their brain receives a signal it's hardwired to interpret as existential. I am not significant enough to warrant even a rejection. Is more devastating than hatred. Hatred confirms importance. Indifference through absence confirms irrelevance. Now here's where you need to be careful. This tactic destroys relationships permanently. That's not a warning to avoid it. That's a warning to use it only when permanent destruction is the goal, because there's no walking this back. Once someone experiences the psychological devastation of your complete absence, the power dynamic can never return to what it was. You become the one who left. And psychologically, we never fully close the chapter on those who chose to close us out. But knowing these first 3 principles isn't enough, because they describe what happens to them. The 4th principle is about what happens to you, and why most people can't sustain strategic disappearance even when they know it's the right move. 4th, psychological devastation. They realize too late that they never had power over you, only your voluntary participation. This is the principle that separates students of power from masters of it. Death. When you disappear strategically, the most profound shift isn't in them, it's in you. Because sustained absence from someone who doesn't serve your interests requires that you've already psychologically divested from their validation. Most people can't disappear because they're still addicted to being seen by the person they're trying to leave. Machiavelli's most controversial insight in The Prince wasn't about cruelty or manipulation. It was about self-sufficiency. He wrote that a prince must be capable of standing alone, because alliances based on dependency are prisons disguised as partnerships. This applies to every relationship structure. When you truly disappear, not as performance, not as manipulation tactic, but as genuine reallocation of your life's attention, you discover something terrifying. How much of your identity was built on being perceived by people who don't actually matter. The colleague whose approval you sought, the family member whose criticism shaped your choices, the romantic partner whose moods determined your emotional state, the friends who kept you small through subtle mockery. Strategic disappearance forces this reckoning. If I'm not performing my identity for these people, who am I? Weak people can't face this question, so they return. They break the silence. They reach out just to check in. They sabotage their own power move because the void of not being perceived by specific people is more terrifying than being disrespected by them. Powerful people recognize this void as liberation. Here's the dark truth. Machiavelli never explicitly wrote but understood completely. Most of your relationships are sustained by your tolerance of being undervalued. The moment you stop tolerating it, the moment you disappear, you reveal that they were borrowing significance from your presence. A senior attorney spent 15 years in a prestigious firm where partners consistently took credit for her work. She planned her exit for 8 months in silence, built a solo practice, recruited clients quietly, then simply didn't show up one Monday. No resignation letter, no explanation, no farewell. The firm panicked. Not because they valued her, they'd demonstrated they didn't, but because her unilateral decision to erase them from her professional narrative exposed that their prestige was built partially on her competence. They'd been borrowing her strength while pretending to grant her opportunity. Her disappearance didn't just change her life, it changed how every other associate viewed the partnership, because she'd demonstrated that the power dynamic only existed through voluntary participation. This is psychological sovereignty, understanding that every hierarchy you're in is sustained by your agreement to remain in it. When you disappear, you're not abandoning a relationship. You're canceling a subscription to a dynamic where your value is systematically underpriced. But here's what's truly dangerous about this level of understanding. Once you successfully reclaim psychological sovereignty through strategic disappearance once, you can never unsee the architecture of power in all your relationships. You start recognizing everywhere you're voluntarily undervalued, every dynamic where your presence is taken for granted, every interaction where explanation is demanded but respect isn't offered, and you start disappearing from all of them. So there's a point of no return, not because you become cold or sociopathic, but because you become intolerant of low-value social exchanges. Your time and attention become the most guarded resources in your life. Machiavelli wrote that the prince must be a great pretender and deceptive. But the deeper reading is that the prince must master strategic feasibility, appearing where his presence creates value, disappearing where it's taken for granted. This isn't antisocial. It's the purest form of social intelligence, understanding that your presence is a gift, not an obligation. Now we arrive at the final 3 principles of psychological devastations that compound over time, because disappearance isn't a single event. It's a sustained recalibration of power that plays out across weeks and months. And each stage reveals deeper layers of what they actually valued about you. 5th, psychological devastation. Your absence reveals how much of their life was organized around you. When someone can summon you with a text, a crisis, a criticism, a need, they never confront how much mental space you occupy, your infrastructure and their psychological architecture. But when you vanish completely, they discover holes in their daily experience they didn't know existed. The friend they complained to, the partner whose reactions validated their worldview, the employee whose competence masked their leadership failures. Machiavelli observed that leaders often don't recognize their dependency on specific advisors until those advisors are suddenly gone through death, betrayal, or strategic withdrawal. The leader believes they're self-sufficient. The absence reveals otherwise. Your disappearance becomes an MRI of their life, revealing which parts only functioned because of your presence. This is devastating because it forces they've been avoiding. They weren't the protagonist of your shared story. They were the supporting character in yours. And now the protagonist has moved to a different narrative entirely. 6th, psychological devastation. Others witness that you didn't need closure, permission, or the last word. Strategic disappearance is never private. Even when done quietly, it sends signals through social networks. When you leave a job without explanation, colleagues notice. When you end a friendship without dramatic confrontation, mutual friends observe. When you exit a romantic relationship without begging for another chance, the dating market updates its valuation. What they witness is frame control mastery. You demonstrated that you don't need to win arguments, don't need to be understood, don't need consensus to make unilateral decisions about your life. This inverts status hierarchies, because the person who can walk away without explanation is always more powerful than the person left explaining the absence to others. Machiavelli wrote extensively about virtue, not virtue in the moral sense, but the capacity for decisive action. Strategic disappearance is pure virtue. It's the refusal to be negotiated with, to be retained through convincing, to be convinced you're making a mistake. Others see this and recalibrate their perception of you. You're no longer the known quantity. You're the one who might disappear on them too if they undervalue you. This creates preemptive respect, a most sustainable form of social power. Seventh and final psychological devastation. They never get closure, which means they never get to move on completely. Human psychology is closure-driven. We need endings to file experiences and move forward. Breakups, firings, arguments, painful as they are, closure allows psychological processing. Strategic disappearance denies this biological need. When you vanish without explanation, you create permanent open tabs in their psychological operating system. They can't fully move on because the story never ended, it just stopped. And stopped stories are cognitively expansive. They drain processing power indefinitely. Years later, they'll still construct explanations, still wonder what you're doing, still measure new people against the void you left. You become the ghost that haunts their personal narrative. Machiavelli understood that the most feared enemies weren't those who were defeated in battle, but those who disappeared before the battle could conclude. Because uncertainty about an enemy's location and intention creates infinite strategic anxiety. You become the adversary or the lost opportunity that's never fully resolved. A man ended a toxic friendship by simply never responding again. No big fight, no explanation, just silence. 5 years later, the former friend was still posting vague social media messages to people who disappear without explanation. 5 years rent-free in his mind, because closure is a gift. And strategic disappearance is the refusal to give that gift to people who didn't value your presence. Now you understand all 7 psychological devastations, but here's how they work together systematically. Stages 1 to 2, disorientation and narrative-sification, happen in the first week. They're scrambling to restore control and make sense of your absence. Stages 3 to 4, attention, withdrawal, and sovereignty, reclamation, happen in weeks 2 to 4. They're experiencing psychological withdrawal, while you're experiencing liberation. Stages 5 to 7, emptiness, mirror, status inversion, and permanent haunting, play out over months and years. These are the long-term devastations that never fully resolve. Together, they create a systematic power transfer. You're not punishing them. You're not playing games. You're simply reallocating your life's attention to people and pursuits that reciprocate value. Now, some will say this is manipulation, that it's cruel, that it's avoiding mature communication. But power doesn't care about labels, and Machiavelli's insight remains true 5 centuries later. The appearance of being manipulable is more dangerous than the accusation of being manipulative. The world is divided into players and pieces. Players understand that their presence is a resource to be strategically allocated. Pieces believe their presence is an obligation to be distributed to whoever demands it. Which one will you be? If you're ready to reclaim power through strategic disappearance, here's your implementation hierarchy. Level 1 today. Identify one low-value relationship where you're over-explaining yourself. Stop. Don't justify. Don't defend. Just stop participating in the dynamic. Level 2 this week. Implement 24 to 48 hour response delays with anyone who treats your immediate availability as entitlement. Train them that your attention has access requirements. Level 3. This month, audit your social obligations. Which ones exist only because you haven't said no? Begin systematic withdrawal from obligations sustained only by your guilt. Level 4. Advanced. When someone disrespects you, resist the instinct to correct them. Disappear from their reality instead. Complete, permanent, silent exit. Level 5. Mastery. Build a life so aligned with your values that strategic disappearance from anything misaligned happens naturally, not react. You now know what 99% of people will never understand. Your absence is more powerful than your presence in situations where your presence has been undervalued. Machiavelli wrote The Prince not as a guide for rulers, but as a manual for understanding power itself, and the ultimate power is the freedom to remove yourself from any game where the rules are designed to keep you losing. You've just learnt the 7 psychological devastations of strategic disappearance. Most people will watch this and do nothing. They'll return to over-explaining, overstaying, and over-giving to people who've demonstrated they don't value it. That's why they stay powerless. If this video resonated with the part of you that's exhausted from performing for others' approval, from negotiating your worth with people who should already recognize it, from staying in rooms where you're the only one who doesn't realize you should, subscribe to this channel. Because the content here isn't about feel-good motivation. It's about power dynamics, frame control, and the dark psychology of social hierarchies. The choice is yours. But remember, ignorance is not bliss. It's slavery to systems designed to extract your value while offering nothing in return. When you simply disappear, you're not running away. You're reclaiming the one resource no one can take from you without your permission: your presence.